Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. It's a June night in East Texas, 1856. The air is so thick and humid, it feels like breathing through wet cloth. Somewhere in the darkness, a cypress swamp exhales its ancient smell, black water, rotting wood, something old and alive all at once. Fireflies blink weakly at the tree line, and the sound of distant laughter and clinking glasses drifts across the lawn of a grand white plantation house where lanterns glow like something out of a fairy tale, but this is not a fairy tale. On that same lawn, dozens of the wealthiest men in the American South are drinking imported whiskey and placing bets, not on horses, not on cards, not on anything reasonable, but on how long a group of human beings will survive before they are shot, mauled, or drowned in that swamp. And in a wooden pen near the tree line, 10, now 13, men stand in the darkness. Unchained for the first time in months, deliberately, cruelly unchained, because the man who owns this plantation believes that a little false hope makes for better sport. He has no idea what kind of hope he has just handed them. This is the story of the Blackwater race, a story that was never supposed to be told, a story that the powerful desperately wanted buried in that swamp alongside all the men who came before. And tonight, you're going to hear every single detail of how it ended. You see, to understand what happened on the night of June 15th, 1856, you have to first understand the world that made it possible. And that world, I want you to really sit with this, was built entirely on the idea that some human beings were not human at all. The Blackwater plantation sat on 0 acres of East Texas wilderness. Pine forests giving way to cypress swamps, dark water stretching out in every direction, land that felt like it was holding its breath. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited every inch of it from his father, along with 147 people he listed in his ledgers as livestock. Now the colonel was not a poor man struggling to survive. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't driven by hardship. He was bored with cotton prices, bored with harvest reports, bored with the ordinary cruelty of the system he'd been handed. He wanted something more, something that made him feel alive, and so in 1849, almost accidentally, he would later claim, he organized the first race. It started as a drunken wager, him and 3 neighboring planters, a bottle of bourbon, the question of whose slaves could run fastest through the swamp at night. But word spread, because men like Colonel Whitmore are never truly alone in their sickness. By the second year, wealthy planters were arriving from as far as Charleston and New Orleans. By the 5th year, it had become a legend in the shadowy world of the plantation elite, whispered about in gentlemen's clubs, discussed over cigars, but never, ever mentioned in polite society. The rules were simple and barbaric. 10 enslaved men released into the swamp at 9 o'clock at night. At 9:15, the hunters followed white men on horseback, rifles loaded, packs of dogs trained to tear human flesh, hearts full of the absolute certainty that they could not lose. And for 7 years they didn't. 70 men had been thrown into that swamp. 70 men had died, shot, drowned, torn apart, swallowed by the mud. Their bodies fed the alligators, their names were forgotten before dawn. And the next morning, while house slaves cleaned blood from the master's boots, life on the plantation continued as if nothing had happened at all. That is the world we're talking about. Hold on to that now, 3 months before the 8th race. April of 1856. A man arrived at Blackwater Plantation in chains. His name, the name the other slaves would come to call him, was Abel. He'd been purchased at auction for $800, nearly half the going rate for a healthy man his age. The reason for the discount was written across his back in a language of scars, 200 lashes, crease, crossing his skin like a brutal map. He had tried to escape his previous plantation in Louisiana twice, been caught both times, 100 lashes each time, and hadn't cried out once. Colonel Whitmore considered him a bargain, a troublemaker, yes, broken now, surely, but cheap, would work hard, no longer dangerous. This is the first of many things the colonel got catastrophically wrong about Abel. Because here's what those two failed escape attempts had actually done. They hadn't broken him, they'd educated him. Abel had learned patience, the kind of deep, cellular patience that comes from understanding that the right moment matters more than the urgent one. He had learned to watch without being seen to watch, to listen without appearing to listen, to gather information while performing the role of a man who has given up. And most crucially, he had learned something that would change everything on that June night. He had learned that freedom achieved alone is no freedom at all. Not when it means leaving people behind, not when your escape is built on the continued suffering of those who sheltered you, who kept your secrets, who looked out for you in the dark. Abel had thought about this for months, in chains on the auction circuit, on the back of a wagon, heading to Blackwater. He had arrived with the seed of an idea already planted. He just needed the right soil. On his third day at the plantation, working in the cotton fields under a sun that turned the air to honey, he overheard two overseers laughing. They were talking about the race and about the $20,000 betting pool from the previous year, about a man who'd tried to hide underwater in a cypress hollow and drowned, about how entertaining it all was. They slapped their thighs, wiped tears from their eyes. Abel said nothing, kept his hands moving through the cotton. But his mind was already calculating. It was Ruth who came to him first, 2 weeks after his arrival. A moonless night. She appeared in his cabin doorway like a shadow with purpose, a house slave who cleaned the colonel's study, who overheard conversations powerful men assumed were private, who could read and write, but kept that skill hidden the way you hide a knife. Abel wasn't sure at first whether to trust her. House slaves who reported to the master in exchange for small privileges, an extra blanket, a softer day, they existed. The masters counted on it, but something in Ruth's eyes stopped him from dismissing her. Not softness. The opposite. A fire so old and so controlled it had turned into something harder than anger. "I ain't no informer," she said quietly. "I've been here 6 years. I seen 3 races. I seen 30 men go into that swamp and never come back." She paused. "One of them was my brother, Daniel. He was 16 years old. The dogs got him in the first hour. I heard him screaming from the main house, where I was serving brandy to the men placing bets on how long he'd last." Imagine being Ruth for a second. Standing in a beautiful room, holding a tray of crystal glasses filled with good whiskey, listening to your brother die in the dark outside while the men you're serving make jokes and collect their winnings. Imagine carrying that for 3 years. Imagine what that does to a person. Imagine what kind of person it forges. She told Abel she'd heard the overseers talking about him, that he'd tried to run twice, taken the lashes without breaking. "I think you're planning something," she said. It wasn't a question, and Abel, weighing the risk for exactly one long moment, nodded. What followed that nod was the beginning of everything. Ruth began pouring information into him like water filling a vessel. The colonel's nightly bourbon, a bottle, sometimes 2, until he could barely walk by 10 o'clock. The overseers playing cards in the barn until midnight. The gun cabinet in the colonel's study, 6 rifles and 4 pistols, all loaded, the key hanging on a hook behind the desk next to a portrait of the colonel's father. 12 dogs in the kennel, 1 handler, deaf in his left ear from a hunting accident 5 years ago. Abel felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. He recognized it. dangerous, treacherous, necessary. Hope, over the weeks that followed, Abel moved through the plantation like a ghost, making contact with each person Ruth had mentioned. Never in groups, larger than 3. Always in different locations: the blacksmith shop where hammer on anvil swallowed their whispered voices, the tobacco barn where thick leaves absorbed sound, the cistern behind the kitchen where the splash of drawn water masked everything. Samuel, the blacksmith, was a massive man and a careful thinker. He began setting aside pieces of scrap iron, never enough to be noticed, slowly, patiently shaping them into crude blades and spikes and lengths of chain. Over 8 weeks, weapons for 10 men, hidden in 3 locations around the property, wrapped in oilcloth against the rust, buried where they could be retrieved in seconds. Moses, who tended the horses, mapped the swamp with the precision of a man who'd spent years retrieving game birds from its edges. He knew which paths led to quicksand and which were safe, where the water was knee-deep and where it dropped suddenly to 10 feet, which cypress roots you could stand on and which concealed sinkholes. He also studied the 8 horses in the main stable, their routines, their fears, the fact that after dark the stable doors were closed but not locked. Because why would you lock them? No slave would dare steal a horse. The punishment was death. Moses was counting on that assumption. Isaiah was the oldest among them, 15 years at Blackwater, hands that shook from decades of brutal labor. But his memory was extraordinary. He could recall every detail of the previous 7 races, the timing, the positions of the hunters, the routes taken. He remembered that the hunters always split into 3 groups, one circling left around the perimeter, one circling right, one driving through the middle like a wedge. He remembered the dogs were always released first, always from the eastern side, where the ground was firmest. He remembered that the colonel never entered the swamp himself. He watched from a raised wooden platform near the starting point, 8 feet high, collecting late bets and distributing winnings. This detail would matter more than any other. Then Ruth brought Abel the piece of information that changed everything. She'd overheard the colonel at dinner, speaking casually to a guest from Mississippi, a man who fancied himself an expert in what he called slave psychology. This year, for the first time, the colonel had decided to leave the selected men unchained for the afternoon before the race. Let them contemplate the possibility of escape, build up their hope before the swamp crushed it. He believed desperate men ran harder. That hope, then its destruction, made for better sport. When Ruth finished telling Abel this, she watched his face carefully. He smiled, and she said later it was not the smile of happiness or relief. It was the smile of a man who has just been handed his enemy's weakness, wrapped up like a gift. "That's when we move," he said. By late May they had 10 men committed, weapons hidden, the swamp memorized. House slaves ready to unlock doors, create distractions, drug food if necessary. Moses ready to scatter the horses at the critical moment. Samuel ready to break into the ammunition storage. But on June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his selections and Abel's heart sank. Among the 10 names called were 3 men who knew nothing about the plan. Simon, a quiet man who had kept his head down for 8 years. David, 42 years old, missing 2 fingers from a lumber mill accident. And Jacob, barely 19, newly torn from his mother in Mississippi, still raw with grief, still harboring the painful illusion that compliance might earn him mercy. 3 wild cards, 3 men who could panic at the wrong moment and unravel everything. Abel approached each one that same evening. He held nothing back, told them everything of the weapons, the timing, the ambush, the risks, and then he gave them a simple choice. Join the plan and fight, or run blindly into the swamp and die like the 70 men before them, while wealthy strangers bet on the minute of their death. Simon asked one question in a voice steady as iron. "You really think we can kill them all?" Abel answered honestly. "No, I think some of us will die, maybe most of us, but I'd rather die trying to take them with me than die running like an animal while they place bets on how long I last." Simon extended his hand. "I'm in. Been waiting 8 years for this." David was harder, older, more worn down by the proof of futility that years of failed resistance tends to provide. "Even if we win here," he said slowly, "they'll send the army. They'll send bounty hunters. They'll make it a national cause." Abel didn't argue. "Maybe, probably, but at least we'll die as men. At least we'll make them pay a price. At least somewhere, some other slave will hear what we did and know it's possible." David looked at his mutilated hand for a long moment. Then he nodded. Jacob wept when Abel spoke to him, but his jaw never trembled. "What do I have to do?" he asked. They were 13, 10 who had planned for months, 3 who had adapted in hours. Not ideal, but it would have to be enough. The final 2 weeks were a specific kind of agony, watching the enemy prepare, knowing everything, saying nothing. Carriages arrived daily. Wealthy men from across the South, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, bringing hunting dogs on leashes and expensive rifles in leather cases. The smell of roasting meat and tobacco smoke hung over the property constantly. At night, lantern light poured from the main house windows as guests drank and told stories about previous hunts, laughing about suffering the way men laugh at nothing at all. Ruth collected names. Richard Beaumont from New Orleans, who owned over 400 slaves across 3 plantations. Henry Caldwell from Alabama, 600 slaves, 4 plantations. A fortune built on cotton and absolute cruelty. Jonathan Reed from South Carolina, who owned a slave trading company and had personally auctioned over 15,000 human beings in his career, separating families with the casual efficiency of a man sorting lumber. These were not desperate men, not poor men, not men who had been forced into evil by circumstance. These were the most powerful members of Southern society, men who shaped laws, men who held congressional seats, men who attended church on Sunday and placed bets on human survival times on Saturday and saw no contradiction in any of it. By June 14th, the betting pool stood at $52, zero in gold coins and banknotes, arranged in leather bags on a special table in the main house like a trophy display. More money than any slave would see in 10 lifetimes of labor. All of it wagered on suffering. June 15th. The day itself, the 13 men were separated from the other slaves and moved to a holding pen near the swamp's edge. Unchained, as promised, 4 armed overseers watched from a raised platform. They were given extra food, cornbread, and actual meat, a mockery of kindness, fueling the bodies the white men intended to hunt. Abel used every minute of it. Speaking too low for the overseers to hear, the group went over every detail one final time. Samuel, near the eastern edge, where the iron blades were buried. Moses heading west toward the horses. Thomas and Benjamin staying together in the center, where wooden spears were hidden under mud and leaves. The critical moment would come not immediately, not in a blind panic, but 30 minutes after release, when the hunters were deep in the swamp, confidence high, guard down. They would not run, they would circle back. "They think we're animals," Abel told the others, each word deliberate and quiet. "They think we'll run in panic, make mistakes, die easy. That's what they've seen for 7 years. That's what they expect. So we give them the opposite. We move slow, we move quiet. We use everything we know about this swamp, and they know nothing about it. And when they come into our territory, spread out and overconfident, we take them apart one by one." At 9 o'clock, the colonel fired his pistol into the sky. The crowd roared, the dogs howled. The lanterns swayed in the excitement of it all, casting those long dancing shadows across faces that had no idea they were celebrating their own ending. The 13 men sprinted into the darkness, but not at full speed. Running all out would exhaust them in minutes. They needed to preserve energy. They needed to stay together. In every previous race, men had scattered in panic, and that individualism had doomed them all. Tonight would be different in every possible way. At exactly 9:15, the second gunshot rang out. The hunters entered the swamp, and the 13 men, already deep in the labyrinth of black water and cypress shadow, split into their 4 units and began to circle back. The first hunter Abel's group found was young, maybe 25, wearing expensive riding clothes now soaked and muddy. He moved carelessly, thrashing through the water, convinced the prey were ahead of him, fleeing in terror. He carried a rifle with silver inlay and a polished stock, a beautiful weapon worth more than Abel's sale price. He never heard Abel rise from the water behind him. He never saw it coming. The second hunter carried a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other, a tactical error that destroyed his night vision while advertising his position to anyone watching from the dark. He had barely noticed Simon rising behind him when the heavy branch came down. He dropped without a sound. They took his pistol and his lantern, too. From different corners of the swamp came the sounds of other engagements. A dog yelping cut short, men shouting in alarm, voices climbing toward fear. Gunshots, then silence. The other groups were at work. When Abel's group reached the western edge, Moses was waiting with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 dead hunters. Moses was holding a pistol he'd taken from one of the bodies, his expression unreadable. The horses, Abel asked, scattered. Moses said quietly, cut the tethers, fired a shot in the air. They panicked. Some of the white men went chasing after them on foot, away from the swamp. He paused, pure chaos, better than they'd hoped. The hunters were trying to regroup now. Abel could hear them calling to each other, voices filled with a confusion that was tipping rapidly toward something else. Toward fear, toward the dawning understanding that they were not the predators anymore. Abel made the decision quickly. All of us together, one fast attack while they're grouped and disoriented. Then we scatter. They moved through the darkness toward those confused voices, and they found the hunters gathered in a clearing, perhaps 15 of them, lanterns raised high, guns pointed at shadows, the posture of men who are trying very hard to convince themselves they are still in control. They were not. Abel's group circled around them, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah emerging from the north like something the swamp itself had sent. 13 men armed with stolen guns, crude iron blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who had reached the place beyond fear, where the only thing left is the absolute clarity of purpose. They attacked from 4 directions simultaneously. The gunfire was deafening, lanterns shattered, men screamed. In the chaos and darkness, hunters fired at each other as often as at the slaves. The fight lasted perhaps 4 minutes, an eternity compressed into pure, terrible violence. When it was over, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. The remaining few fled blindly into the dark, their courage dissolved, running the way they had expected their prey to run. Abel took stock in the ringing silence. They had lost Benjamin, shot in the chest in the opening exchange. They had lost David, skull crushed by a rifle butt. 11 men remained. They emerged from the swamp covered in mud and blood, and found the plantation in complete disarray. Guests who hadn't entered the swamp were frantically gathering their belongings. Servants ran in every direction. The horses that hadn't been scattered were being hastily saddled by trembling hands. And Colonel Whitmore stood on his raised platform, the one he'd used for 7 years to collect bets on human death. his face purple with rage and bourbon and a terror he was only just beginning to understand. "What are you doing?" he screamed at the fleeing guests, his voice cracking. "They're slaves, just slaves. We have guns, we have numbers, we can." Moses shot him from 30 feet away with hands steady as ground. The colonel fell backward off the platform and landed in the dirt of the yard. He had walked like a king. What followed was not a battle. It was something else entirely. Ruth and the other house slaves poured out of the main house with kitchen knives and iron fireplace pokers and heavy candlesticks. Samuel broke into the weapons cabinet in the colonel's study and distributed rifles to anyone who could hold one. And the other 134 enslaved people on that plantation, people who had not been part of the plan, who had not been told anything they saw the moment, understood it in their bones and rose. 147 people, years of terror and grief and humiliation, bottled and pressurized, and now suddenly, finally, released all at once. By midnight, it was finished. 34 white men lay dead. The main house was burning, flames reaching into the night sky like a beacon, consuming the grand architecture that slave labor had built. The stables were burning, the cotton storehouse was burning. Smoke and fire turned the darkness into something that could be seen for miles in every direction. In the colonel's study, before the fire consumed it, they found the leather bags, $52,000 in gold and paper, all the wealth that had been wagered on their deaths. Abel stared at it for a long moment. Then he picked up one bag and threw it into the growing flames. "We're not thieves," he said. "We're not property anymore. We're free people, and free people don't take blood money." Every single person in that room followed his example without hesitation. $52,000, the price of 7 years of human slaughter, burning to ash and smoke and nothing. As dawn broke over what remained of Blackwater Plantation, 143 people stood in the yard, watching the sky turn orange and pink. No longer property, no longer slaves. They took what supplies they could carry: food, tools, weapons, blankets. They freed all the remaining animals. Then they left in small groups, moving in different directions initially to confuse any pursuit, all of them ultimately heading south and west toward Mexico and the freedom that no American law would give them. They left behind nothing but smoke and ruins and a story. And here is the thing about stories. The powerful spend enormous energy trying to bury them, trying to ensure that the people they oppress never hear about successful resistance, never learn that it's possible, never feel the specific dangerous electricity of knowing that someone like them once stood up and won. But stories find their way. The story of Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted moved from plantation to plantation across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, whispered in cotton fields, coded into spirituals, passed between people in the dark. It grew with each telling, the way true stories do, accumulating weight and meaning. And every plantation owner who heard some version of it felt something they were unaccustomed to feeling. Fear, the specific, quiet, erosive fear of a man who realizes for the first time that the people he has brutalized have been watching him just as carefully as he's been watching them. That they have been patient, that they have been waiting, that they have been planning. The Blackwater Plantation stood empty for years after that night. The state seized it eventually and tried to auction it off, but no one wanted it. People said you could hear screaming from the swamp on moonless nights. The buildings collapsed from neglect. The swamp took back the land. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks later, after fighting through pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. Most survived. Some returned years later, after the Civil War, to search for the families torn from them by slavery. Some disappeared into history entirely, their fates unknown, their names unclaimed by official record. But here is what I want you to hold on to as this story ends. Abel was not a superhero. He was a man who had been beaten until his back was a ruin of scar tissue, who had watched his wife and children sold away to strangers, who had failed twice before this. He was a man who had every reason in the world to conclude that resistance was futile, that the system was too large and too brutal to fight, that survival required compliance and compliance required silence, and he chose otherwise, not because he was certain of success. He told Caleb, told David, told all of them honestly, some of us will probably die. Maybe most of us, maybe all of us. He chose otherwise because he had decided, at some point in the dark of a Louisiana cabin, that dying as a human being was worth more than surviving as property. He organized, he trusted, he built something collective out of individual grief and rage. He turned the intimate knowledge of oppression, the detailed understanding that only comes from years of being forced to observe your oppressor, into a weapon. And he won, not cleanly, not without loss. Benjamin and David gave their lives that night, and their names deserve to be spoken alongside Abel's. But he won. There is something in this story that goes beyond 1856, beyond Texas, beyond the specific horror of American slavery. It is a story about what happens when the powerful make one fundamental mistake, when they confuse compliance with acceptance, when they mistake silence for surrender, when they look at people they have brutalized and conclude that because those people have not yet acted, they cannot act. That because they haven't fought back visibly, they have stopped thinking, stopped planning, stopped believing in the possibility of something different. That mistake has been made throughout history, in every place where human beings have been stripped of their dignity and their freedom and their names. And throughout history, it has ended the same way, with fire, with reckoning. With the sudden, irreversible discovery that patience is not the same thing as acceptance, and that hope, dangerous, treacherous, necessary hope, does not die just because you chain the hands that carry it. Abel knew that. He carried it with him all the way to Mexico, into whatever quiet life he built south of the border, across whatever years remained to him. Freedom is not given, it is taken, paid for in blood and fire, and the absolute refusal to accept what the world insists is your fate. Remember that.